So today we'll be talking about a whole heart. In the series, we're talking about our whole selves, and we're kind of breaking it down to how we experience the wholeness. And last week we talked about spiritually, today the heart. Next week, Michael will talk about the mind, and then we'll get into the physical with strength. So, have you all seen this before? This is a diagram Michael and I were taught in college, and the idea is that in our lives, we don't let the feelings lead. We put our faith in the facts, the feelings follow. And there is some truth to this, because we don't want to be like driven by our emotions and our feelings in life. But at the same time, there's some things about this whole teaching and this that fall short, because it denies that there can be good in our feelings and our emotions. And it minimizes the place of our hearts. It just tells us, live from our brains and don't worry about what you're feeling. That'll come, but live from your head. And our hearts are equally important. Now, you've probably also been taught you can't trust your heart. Jeremiah 17:9 says the heart is deceitful. And so you can't trust your heart. Again, it's part of the truth. An unhealthy and unredeemed heart, yes, cannot be trusted. An unhealthy and unredeemed heart can lead us astray and following down the wrong places. But Jesus said in Luke 6:45, a good man brings good things out of the good stored in his heart. And an evil man brings evil things out of the evil stored up in his heart. For the mouth speaks what the heart is full of. So Jesus acknowledges there can be a good heart. I would say that's a heart that is aligned with God, and a heart that grows out of the spiritual wholeness that we talked about last week. If you remember, we defined spiritual wholeness as mutual delight and service with God through faith in Jesus and the power of the Spirit. When we abide in that connection with God, that brings forth good fruit, which I would say includes a good or whole heart. Before I move on, how about we define what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the heart? The Bible talks about the heart in both the Greek and the Hebrew as our inner self, our inner life. Our thoughts, our emotions, our feelings, our will. So today I'm going to focus on the emotions and will part of the heart. And we recognize that as we're talking about these different parts of ourselves, we're trying to draw lines where these parts overlap. So Michael will be talking next week about the mind and the thoughts and more of that part of the inner life. I'll be talking today about the emotions and will part of the heart. And just be aware also that as we grow in any of these, it impacts all of them, right? As we align our lives with God in the spiritual realm, it impacts everything else. As our hearts become more whole, it impacts our minds and our spirits and everything. So it all connects. It's all part of the whole self. So before I move on, let me pray for God's word this week. Holy Spirit, we thank you that you are here. We thank you that you are speaking. And I pray that your word would transform our lives and would connect our hearts even more with your heart. Amen. So, first of all, some things that the Bible teaches about the heart. First, we are told to guard our hearts. Proverbs 4:23 tells us, above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. When we think about the heart as being the inner life, the will, and the emotions, it makes a lot of sense that everything we do flows from our heart. Whether our actions come from conscious or unconscious choices, they are rooted in what's going on in our hearts to begin with. So we need to be careful and guard our hearts because that's where our life comes from. What does a guard do? So the guard actually has several jobs. Yeah, this is kind of funny. This is what probably a lot of us think of when we think of a guard. But the guard will stand outside and watch over the entrance, making sure that nobody comes in, nothing comes in that shouldn't get in. So the guard watches over the entrance. The guard also protects those who are inside. So the guard is watching over, in England, the royal family who are there, making sure that they're all safe, making sure everyone and everything inside is safe. And then if anything bad, unhealthy, damaging, disruptive does get in, the guard will make sure that it doesn't stay in. The guard will remove it for them. So there's kind of three senses of the guarding the heart. Watching over what can come in, kind of being the filter of what's okay to come in, protecting what's inside, and also removing anything inside that shouldn't be there. What does it mean for us to guard our hearts? What do we guard against? How do we do it? I'm not going to fully explore those questions because if we did, we'd probably be here all week. There's a lot to this. So I want to look at two specific areas this morning that really do impact how we show up in life. It impacts how we show up in our relationships with others and in our service with God. So we need to guard against a hard heart and a faint heart. How do we guard our hearts? I love this verse from 2 Thessalonians 3:5. Very simple. It says, "May the Lord direct your hearts into God's love and Christ's perseverance." Here's a spoiler alert. God's love is the antidote to a hard heart. Christ's perseverance is the antidote to a faint heart. We'll look at each of those one at a time. Start with guarding against a hard heart. When I talk about a hard heart, who in the Bible comes to mind?
Saul.
Saul had a hard heart. Who else? Go back a little further in history.
Pharaoh.
Pharaoh.
Oh,
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. He had a
Yeah.
Yeah, and there are two things that I see when I was looking at Pharaoh and how he treated the Israelite people, the Hebrews. First, he objectified and dehumanized them. They were his slaves. They were less than human. They were his tools to accomplish whatever he needed, his building projects for his own glory and honor. It didn't matter what happened to them because they were less than human. They didn't matter. So he objectified and dehumanized them. He was also only concerned about his own interests. Again, the Hebrews, they were there to do what he wanted done. But even his own people, I don't think he cared too much about what happened to the Egyptians either. You think about Moses and Aaron, they came to him and said, okay, God says let my people go. If you don't, this is going to happen. This plague is going to happen. And he said, bring it. And then his people suffered, and he didn't care until it affected him. And he was uncomfortable, and he was inconvenienced. And then he called and said, okay, can you ask your God to make this stop? And then they would relent. And you'd think that by the third or fourth plague, he would have gotten this. Like, okay, if they say something's going to happen, then yeah, I guess there really will be frogs everywhere. I guess there are locusts coming, but he just kept letting it come on because he was really only concerned about himself. Is it going to impact him? Until it got to the point that dramatic death impacted every home in Egypt, even his. And then he said, okay, get out, go, I'm done. But then the next day, he's like, no, we're going to bring him back by force. So the things about the hard heart that I see are, one, objectifying and dehumanizing others, the other being only concerned about our own interests. And lest we dehumanize Pharaoh too, which is easy to do when we see someone, especially someone in power, who behaves like this, let's take a step back and realize that, yes, he was unfeeling and and entitled because he had lived his entire life being told that he was a god. That's what he learned to believe about himself, that he could do anything he wanted with anyone he wanted, and it didn't matter. He lived in a world and in a culture where gods were capricious. They did anything they wanted. They didn't care about the people. They were just there to be served and make themselves, get whatever they wanted. Until, in Pharaoh's case, these upstart Hebrews came and demanded that he let go all of his slaves. I don't think so. And then he found himself in this win-lose situation with another god. He didn't know what he was up against, that this was the true God who was going to make happen everything that he said was going to happen. But so Pharaoh, even then, he was human too. And he came from a place of living the way he thought he was supposed to live. So today, when we look at people with hard hearts, when we look at examples of hard hearts today, the objectifying labels, dehumanizing others, only concern for our own safety, comfort, whatever. Some things that we see in our world today, gossip. I'm going to talk about whoever, make them look worse. I'm going to make myself look better. I don't care how it impacts other people. We see cyberbullying, where especially teens will get online and put down others and make others feel worse and feel bad. Oh gosh, and then there's all the labels. I think we live in a world of labels. The boomers. We talk about the millennials. We don't talk about Gen X, so we have to talk about ourselves, right? But there is those immigrants, the homeless, the addicts, the liberals, the conservatives. You get the point. We live in a world of labels where we look at people through these lenses of a name, a label, and then we expect something of them. We don't look often beyond the label to see the person. Now, here at his shelter, I will tell you, we are good at looking past the labels. We are very good at seeing the one in front of us, at loving people where they are, and at bringing God's grace into the situation. And we need to guard what is inside. We need to guard the good that is in the sense of protecting what is good in our hearts. And we do that in community with one another and in connection with God. As we're sharing this testimonials with each other earlier this morning, it's beautiful to see how we are encouraging each other as we share our own experience to love others and see them as human. So the antidote or the solution to a hard heart is God's love. I'm going to get really practical here. Michael and I love the writings of Dr. Jim Wilder, if any of you have heard of him. He calls his work neurotheology. So he is trained as a neuroscientist and he studies the Bible. And he uses these two things together to inform how we see the Bible and how our brains work together. And he doesn't use neuroscience to explain the Bible. He brings them together in a way that shows how, like the Bible, this is how God made our brains, and this is what he wrote and to teach us, and then this is how our brains work. And it's just really amazing, his work. So anyway, Jim Wilder and Michael Hendricks wrote a book called The Other Half of the Church. And in this book, they share how the relational part of our brains, for those of you who need to know, that's the right side. I won't go into all of the science behind that. But this relational part is constantly looking for joyful connections and attachments with others. They quote Dr. Alan Shore, who defines this relational joy as being the sparkle in someone's eye. Healthy character formation happens not from information and knowledge, but from being in a close relationship with Jesus and experiencing that relational joy with him. Wilder and Hendricks say brain science reveals that this joy sensation is crucial for emotional and relational development. And this is what God's love looks like. This is why when Michael and I are teaching and leading you through meditation processes, we begin by helping you to connect to God's loving presence. We want you to feel and know that you are the sparkle in God's eye. Because we know that God's love and connection with him is what transforms us. I could talk to you all day sharing examples and teachings about having a tender heart, but just hearing and knowing that will never change how you live. It's actually experiencing God's tender love for you that will help you grow in loving others. So we're going to do what I'm going to call a heart check. We're going to take a few minutes, just a few minutes. I'm going to have everybody pair off with one other person, or if we have maybe an odd number, I'm not counting, but we can do this. We can have 3, but I really want to keep these small. And I'm going to put 2 questions up on the screen in a minute. And what we'll do is we'll share briefly answers to the questions. We don't need to go into telling stories or backgrounds, just share your first thought response to the question. Somebody will ask, there's 2 questions, you can take one question at a time, each person share. And know that there is no judgment in this room. We are able to hold space together for each other's honesty. So go ahead, and Michael, you can put the questions up and can find a partner. So the questions are, have you had a hard heart towards another person or a group of people? And how do you see God's love changing you? All right. So in addition to guarding against a hard heart, we need to guard against, like I said, a faint heart. So while Pharaoh was there in Egypt oppressing and objectifying the people, only concerned about his own concerns and stuff, Moses, in the meantime, was off hiding in the wilderness as a shepherd. Moses had a faint heart. And then one day, God very obviously, very clearly came to Moses. I mean, you cannot dispute this. The bush was on fire and it was not burning up. God audibly and clearly spoke to Moses. God said to Moses, go to Pharaoh, tell him to let my people go. And Moses said, I think you have the wrong person. And so God said, I'll be with you. He promised his presence. He even made an amazing promise that this is going to succeed and you and the people will come back to this very spot and worship me on this mountain. And Moses said, I don't think they're going to believe that you said it. So this conversation goes on most of chapters 3 and 4 of Exodus. And God promises Moses that they will believe him. He gives Moses his name to say, this is who sent you. He gives Moses miraculous signs that he can do so that the people and Pharaoh will believe him. He equips Moses with everything he needs, and Moses says, please send someone else. He literally said that. It's in Exodus 4:13. Please send someone else. Moses had a faint heart, which I would say is a heart that is overcome and ruled by emotions. This is what that train diagram is trying to help us see that we don't want to do in our life, letting our emotions just drive everything in our lives. And thinking about Moses, it's easy to say he was afraid, he was timid, but I think there's more to it than that. He had been gone for 40 years. I imagine that around his absence and the way he left Egypt, there was a lot of grief, shame, maybe even anger under all of that. He hadn't seen his family, his home family, for over 40 years. It's very likely that his parents were gone. He had probably missed out on the opportunity to be blessed by his father at his father's passing. He left Egypt because he murdered someone and knew he was seen and he was going to be caught, and so fear, shame over that. He had a whole new family. He was married with children now, and what would happen to them if he took them back? What would happen if he left them and didn't take them back? So much, I think, was going into Moses' reaction. So there's so much with Moses that gave him this faint heart that he didn't want to do what God would tell him to do. And we can see that in our own lives too. When we have strong, overwhelming feelings, why is it there? My friend Cynthia likes to say, and she's Brazilian, so she says this with a great accent, but she says, when I'm having a feeling, I ask myself, why am I feeling this feeling? When we are triggered, when we are overwhelmed by emotions, we need to step back and find safety so that we can explore what's underneath it. I think of the emotions as like the proverbial canary in the coal mine. You've probably heard this story from years ago. Coal miners knew that there could be deadly gases that would build up in the mines, but you couldn't detect them, and they could just kill everybody. So they would take a caged bird with them down into the mine, knowing that if there were gases like carbon monoxide or others that could kill them, that it would kill the bird far more quickly than a grown man. So if the bird was dead, everybody got out. And in the same way, we can think of our emotions when we're triggered, when we're overwhelmed, as a signal to stop, find safety, and explore why I'm feeling this. In my own life, I'll be a little vulnerable here. Recently, I found myself overwhelmingly triggered by random messes in the house. You know, the girls dump out their toys, walk away, and then I'm asking them to clean up, and they're like, it's too hard, it's too much. And then I don't just like, I mean, it's annoying, yes, but I found myself like overreacting to it, using very harsh language and shaming and just reacting in a very unhealthy way. So I finally, when I became aware that I was doing that, I stepped back and I was like, why? What's underneath this? Well, without going really deep into my story, I grew up in a situation where my sister and I were expected to pretty much clean the house all the time and keep the house clean while mom was at work. And then my mom would do this thing. You know how when a friend has a crisis or a need, and we all rally around and we bring meals and we might come over to clean their house and things like that. So my mom would send me and my sister and not come with us to go clean her friend's house.
Nice.
So for me, this idea of cleaning up stuff that I'm not responsible for triggers some really deep, unhealthy stuff inside. So now that I've become aware of that and why I'm behaving the way I'm behaving, then I can temper my responses. It doesn't mean I'm not holding the kids responsible for making messes, but I'm responding in a better way to it all now. And again, I will say that here at his shelter, I see a lot of strong hearts. I see people willing to step out, facing our doubts and uncertainties to follow where God leads. I see people here who are willing to face our emotions and uncover the work that we need to do to grow. So again, we need to protect it. We need to protect and guard our hearts. Protect the good that's in there. The solution or the antidote for a faint heart is Christ's perseverance. I think about Hebrews 12:2, which tells us that for the joy set before him, Jesus endured the cross. he endured the horrors, the shame, the unimaginable pain of the cross for the joys of being reunited with his Father. The joy of knowing that his purpose on earth was accomplished. The joy of saving you, me. For those joys, he could look beyond the cross that he was enduring and persevere through it. In Moses' story, God didn't start with go to Pharaoh and demand that he let my people go. God actually started with, I have seen the suffering of my people. I am going to rescue them. And I am going to bring them out into a land flowing with milk and honey. I am going to turn around everything they're suffering and bless them abundantly. Now, if Moses had focused on that joy set before him, we wouldn't have most of Exodus 3 and 4. But I'm kind of glad that we do, because it shows us how we live sometimes in that faint heart, and it shows us that God still uses someone who is uncertain, who doesn't want to do it, but God still uses us. For us, yes, life is hard, and sometimes it feels unbearably hard, and we need that perseverance of Christ to get through. And we can look beyond the pain of this moment to the joys of heaven. We can look forward to an eternity completely freed from the pain and sin of this world. Forever in God's literal presence, experiencing his love fully, intimately. We can look forward to transcending peace and joy in communion with God and others. And in comparison to that, as Paul said, today's pain and suffering is nothing. That doesn't mean it isn't hard. If it weren't hard, we wouldn't need perseverance. But the perseverance of Christ and looking beyond the pain to the joy, knowing confidently that is on the other side, that can give us the perseverance we need. So let's go back to our little groups and we'll do another quick heart check. Again, remember, just share a few sentences. We don't need to tell stories, and we can hold this non-judgmental space for one another. So the questions we'll look at now: is there a hard or overwhelming emotion in your life that you need to look under to see why it's there? And can you embrace Christ's perseverance to get through the hard in your life now?
Against the wall and watch just, and that's how I got rid of that.
So we can come back to this diagram, facts, faith, feelings, which I think we probably might all be convinced that falls a little bit short, right? So here is a better way, I think, to look at it. Our life like an airplane. The wings are the heart and the mind, the feelings and the faith. Which wing on an airplane is more important?
The right one.
Always the right one. Without one of the wings, the airplane is going down, right? The other thing too is it is the wings that keep the plane in the air. It's not the power of the jet engines. The wings keep the plane flying. So we need both. We need our heart and our mind. We need our faith and our feelings in order to live a whole life. So to wrap up, let's look at, we've talked a lot, what is heart wholeness? We would define heart wholeness as an inner life that is connected to God's heart and focused on God's purposes. The whole heart is tender and strong. It is connected to God's love. It is empowered by Christ's perseverance. Some specific things we would say that heart wholeness looks like. It is experiencing a full range of emotions restored to their sinless beauty in Christ. Our emotions are here. They are important. God gave us emotions. God has emotions. And so when we can experience our emotions without them taking over and running our lives, but just experience what we're feeling, that is wholeness. That is healthy emotions. I will also say just being aware of what is underneath our emotions is another part of this. A second thing is that a whole heart is a will that is aligned with God's will and purposes. Knowing God's purposes for the world, for us, for our lives. It doesn't necessarily have to be specific. It can be general, but when we are aligned with God's purposes, that is a whole heart. And the third thing we practiced, I didn't really even talk about much, but we practiced being vulnerable with others from a place of safety and security in God's love. And I loved that it was hard to call you all back from your sharing time because you were embracing this vulnerability with one another. So our culture tells us follow our hearts. Our church tells us don't dare follow your heart. The reality is when we have a whole and healthy heart, when we live from the whole heart, we can follow our hearts. Because our heart will lead in line with God's will, in line with God's plan. Like Jesus said, the good person brings good things up out of their hearts. Our healthy, whole hearts are guarded against hardness by God's love and guarded against faintness by Christ's perseverance. When our hearts are both tender and strong, led by God's love and Christ's perseverance, then we can trust our hearts, we can trust our feelings alongside of our faith to lead us according to God's will.